Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has canceled all of his planned foreign trips as Russia intensifies its attacks on the eastern Kharkiv region. This new offensive began last week, taking advantage of Ukraine's shortages of weapons following delays in Western supplies. But Ukraine says the Russian side is suffering record numbers of casualties, and the Ukrainian army has been aiming to disrupt Russia's supply lines by striking inside Russia itself.
Ukrainian soldiers firing at Russian positions in the Kharkiv region, where few expected there would be significant fighting again. More than 2 years into Russia's war in Ukraine, the front line overall has not moved much in months. But last week, Russia opened a new front north of the city of Kharkiv, with an estimated 30,000 soldiers retaking some villages and bombarding the town of Vovchansk. That has spurred an evacuation and a sense of whiplash. The region was amongst the first to fall when Russia invaded in 2022, but was retaken in a lightning Ukrainian counteroffensive later that year. Russia's attacks here have already drawn Ukrainian forces away elsewhere on the front line. Ukraine is finding itself short of manpower and of weapons after months of delay while the U.S. Congress argued over more deliveries. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a rushed surprise visit to Kyiv to address the worsening situation, saying the new deliveries will change the dynamic.
We know this is a challenging time, but we also know that in the near term, the assistance is now on the way. Some of it's already arrived. More of it will be arriving. And that's going to make a real difference against the ongoing Russian aggression on the battlefield.
Ukraine, meanwhile, says it needs more.
Air defense, the biggest deficit for us. I think that the biggest problem, yes, and we need today 2 Patriots for Kharkiv.
One factor that could help Ukraine succeed is the increasing willingness of its supporters to allow attacks inside Russia to slow the flow of Russian military supplies and hinder advances. Ukraine says the U.S. formally asked it not to conduct such strikes for fear of escalation. But Kyiv now believes that has changed. And Secretary Blinken said that while the U.S. doesn't encourage it, Ukraine must decide for itself what to do with long-range weapons. While the UK has already said that Ukraine has the right to strike military targets in Russia, other allies have been more muted, and Germany still does not want its weapons used on Russian territory. There have been several strikes using non-Western weapons in recent weeks on Belgorod, a Russian city near the border to the Kharkiv region, including this one where a missile was allegedly shot down and hit an apartment building. Belgorod is a major logistics hub, and one Ukrainian media outlet claims Russia is building a new military airport there. Drone and missile attacks there have killed dozens, according to Russian authorities. That gives Russia another reason to fight in northern Kharkiv, to establish a buffer zone by pushing Ukraine's artillery and missile launchers farther away from its own borders to make those attacks more difficult. For both sides, timing is crucial. If Russia gains even more ground before Ukraine gets reinforcements and weapons, Kyiv may find it much harder to keep fighting back.
All right, I'm joined now from Washington by George Barrows from the Institute for the Study of War. George, it's good to have you with us. Clear this up for us, if you would. Has the needle moved at all on U.S. policy concerning Ukraine striking Russian territory with U.S. weapons?
Thank you very much for having me, Brent. As far as we can tell, no, the needle has not moved. Yesterday, the deputy spokesperson for the State Department reiterated what has unfortunately become boilerplate rhetoric for the U.S. State Department. The U.S. government does not support the Ukrainians conducting attacks in Russian territory. They usually add on, but it is ultimately the Ukrainians' decision. But the facts on the ground are that the Ukrainians, over the last 72 hours, have conducted numerous long-range artillery strikes against the Russian deep rear in Crimea, but they've not yet struck military assets in Belgorod.
Okay, you say that's what's happening on the ground, and the official policy has not changed. The Ukrainians seem to be saying that the White House has been saying something different behind closed doors. I mean, have you heard anything to that extent?
So far, not. And unfortunately, the facts on the ground are that the Russians have been able to amass up to 30 to 50,000 Russian troops on the other side of the international border. And my team at the Institute, we collect and study a lot of combat footage. And when the Russians began this new operation just a couple of days ago, we saw the Ukrainians striking the Russians when they were right either on the border or quite literally a few hundred meters across the border. So we know that the Ukrainians could see them, but they're not engaging them and making a conscious decision to not engage them until after they cross the border. I suspect we will know that the policy has indeed changed, in fact, or at least behind the scenes, once we start seeing the Ukrainians interdicting Russian aircraft behind the lines, in Russian airspace, or we start seeing some deep strike fires into de jure Russian territory.
Yeah, what seems certain is that Antony Blinken's words in Kyiv this week, they're being interpreted as a policy shift by Kyiv, at least. Do you think that we will now see the Ukrainian military targeting Russian territory with American weaponry?
I don't think so. Not until we actually get the real policy change. I think that we'll probably in the near future see a demonstrative Ukrainian strike using the British Storm Shadow missiles now that the UK has officially announced that it is okay. What I expect the Ukrainians are doing is they're trying to find an appropriate target that will create the informational effects to demonstrate definitively that, yes, the Ukrainians can use UK-provided weapons and NATO-provided weapons on Russian territory, and that it doesn't result in any sort of catastrophic escalation, to make it clear that those prohibitions can similarly be lifted by the United States. I'd also add that this is not the first time that we've had this sort of pattern where the United Kingdom actually sort of breaks the taboo on what Washington is not willing to do, and then Washington follows suit. Yeah. Notably, last year, it's the Brits that led with the main battle tanks, long-range strike, and now with this.
Yeah, it sounds like you're describing a NATO that is softening its stance and its restrictions placed on Ukraine's use of Western weapons.
Absolutely. I think Europeans writ large understand the stakes better. They understand the military stakes better. And they understand that, Putin's red lines and his nuclear saber rattling, those are really hollow threats, because the Ukrainians in a variety of different ways have already contested many of those red lines and proven that the Russians are really trying to use threats to constrain our own decisions, so that the Russians are forcing us to have the Ukrainians fight the fight that the Russians would fight, rather than the fight that the Ukrainians need to fight to ensure their defense.
George Barrows from the Institute for the Study of War. George, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Brent.